At the dawn of World War I, a single German submarine sank 3 British cruisers in under an hour, shattering centuries of naval tradition. Submarines were no longer novelties, they were predators. But this was neither the beginning nor the end of their evolution. This is the story of how they rose from wooden barrels to weapons capable of obliterating nations. Underwater navigation has stirred the imaginations of humans for millennia. In ancient Greece, stories flourished of men descending into the depths. None more striking than the tale of Alexander the Great being lowered into the sea in a primitive glass barrel to observe marine life. A feat likely more myth than history, but it shows how humankind has longed to conquer the depths beneath the waves. But it wasn't until the 17th century until this feat was finally accomplished. One of the first real steps towards underwater travel came from an unlikely figure at the English court, Cornelius Drebbel, a Dutch inventor in the service of King James I. He crafted what many consider to be the world's first navigable submarine. Drebbel's submarine, a wooden rowboat reinforced with greased leather and fitted with tubes for air, featured 6 oars and space for 16 passengers. Around 1620, Drebbel took his invention to the River Thames to put on a demonstration in front of thousands, including King James I himself. Remarkably, the vessel remained submerged for 3 hours, completing a round trip from Westminster to Greenwich while gliding between 12 and 15 feet below the surface. Drebbel even took King James on a dive beneath the river, making him the first monarch in history to travel underwater. Despite multiple successful trials on the Thames, the invention failed to win over the Admiralty and was ultimately never deployed. Though propelled by human-powered oars and limited in depth and duration, it demonstrated, for the first time, that underwater travel was possible. But its military application won't be realised for some time yet. Over a century later, during the American Revolutionary War, submarines were experimented with again. This time in the form of a peculiar one-man vessel shaped like a walnut. Built by Yale-educated inventor David Bushnell, the Turtle was the world's first military submarine. Operated by hand crank and foot pump, the Turtle was designed to sneak beneath British warships in New York Harbour and attach timed explosives. In 1776, under the command of Sergeant Ezra Lee, it attempted to strike HMS Eagle. The mission failed. Lee only had a maximum of 30 minutes of air and couldn't drill through the ship's copper hull. But the event marked the first time a submarine was used in combat. Despite its failure, the Turtle proved a bold concept. The underwater attack was not only conceivable, but achievable. Still, these early pioneers battled more than enemy ships. They fought physics, fear, and the unforgiving laws of pressure and oxygen. Their craft were fragile, their missions experimental, and their outcomes uncertain. But along came the industrial age, and with it, a new stream of experimentation and new technologies that would accelerate the early development of the submarine. One of the most significant turning points in the evolution of the submarine came in the early 19th century when an American inventor named Robert Fulton launched a vessel that many now consider the world's first practical submarine, known as the Nautilus. Built in 1800 and tested in the waters of France, the Nautilus was a fully realized military submersible, streamlined, maneuverable, and built with a specific mission in mind: to deliver underwater mines to enemy ships. Unlike earlier submersibles, Fulton's Nautilus featured innovations that would become staples of submarine design. A collapsible snorkel-like air intake, a hand-crank propeller for propulsion, ballast tanks for submerging and surfacing. It was capable of diving up to depths of 25 feet and remaining submerged for up to 8 hours. The Nautilus was built to carry a weapon Fulton called a carcass, an early naval mine meant to be pulled toward enemy ships, where it exploded using a detonator. Napoleon was intrigued, but ultimately declined to fund it, and the British dismissed it as a dangerous oddity. Still, Fulton's work marked a leap forward. Fulton's Nautilus was the first submarine to take on a shape and structure we can recognize today. It featured a streamlined, fish-like hull, early ballast tanks for diving and surfacing, and even a primitive conning tower. In many ways, it was a prototype for the submarine's modern form and showcased its potential. That potential became brutal reality some 6 decades later in Charleston Harbor during the American Civil War. Here, the Confederate States deployed a vessel built from desperation and ingenuity. The HL Hunley, a 40-foot long hand-crank submersible built out of iron, looked more like a sinking coffin than a ship. Its mission was singular and suicidal: to sneak up on a Union warship and detonate an explosive charge using a spar-mounted torpedo. On the night of February 17, 1864, the Hunley made history. Creeping just below the surface, it struck the USS Housatonic and detonated its charge, sinking the massive warship within minutes. It was the first successful submarine attack in the history of naval warfare, but triumph turned to tragedy. The explosion, or the pressure wave, sank the Hunley as well, killing all 8 crewmen aboard. The sub was lost for over a century until it was recovered in the year 2000. The Hunley's grim success proved what the Nautilus had only hinted at. Submarines were not merely experimental, they were deadly. Crude, cramped, and dangerous to operate, yes, but no longer laughable. They had killed. While America's waters bore witness to the first submarine kill, another breakthrough was taking shape in France to address a critical flaw in submarines: the need for human power. By the mid-19th century, inventors across Europe had begun to abandon the idea that human-powered propulsion, oars, cranks, treadmills, could ever make submarines truly viable. To survive and function beneath the surface, these vessels would need mechanical propulsion, reliable navigation, and eventually, the means to strike. In 1863, the French Navy launched the Plongeur, the first submarine in history to be powered by a mechanical engine. Rather than relying on steam or muscle, Plongeur used a compressed air engine to drive a singular propeller, allowing the vessel to move under its own power. Though large and unwieldy and capable of only brief submersion, it was a monumental leap forward. Plongeur proved that submarines could be mechanically propelled without exposing their crews to exhausting manual labour or dangerous boiler systems. It also demonstrated the viability of onboard machinery operating in a sealed underwater environment, an essential step in the evolution of modern subs. 2.5 decades later, French engineers pushed the concept even further. In 1888, France launched the Gymnote Q1, a sleek, electrically powered submarine that was decades ahead of its time. Equipped with rechargeable batteries, hydroplanes, an operational periscope, and even torpedo tubes. Gymnote was not only a technical marvel, it was a genuine prototype of what a combat-ready submarine might one day become. It demonstrated that a vessel could maneuver, dive, and fire weapons while submerged. But with only 8 hours of battery life and having to return to dock to recharge, it had extremely limited range and could only operate close to the shore. Yet even with these innovations, no single vessel had yet managed to bring together all the necessary elements of a true combat submarine. However, that moment was fast approaching. John Philip Holland, a former schoolteacher turned marine engineer, had long been captivated by the dream of underwater warfare. After emigrating to the United States from Ireland, he began building submarines at his own expense. His breakthrough came in 1897 with the launch of the Holland IV, a 53-foot cigar-shaped vessel that for the first time combined all the elements necessary for true combat effectiveness: a reliable internal combustion engine for surface travel, electric batteries for submerged operation, torpedo tubes, and a pressure hull strong enough to dive repeatedly and safely. The US Navy purchased it in 1900 and became the USS Holland, the first US Navy submarine. When Harry Caldwell took command of the Holland, he became the first naval submarine commanding officer in history. Unlike its clumsy predecessors, the Holland could navigate with precision, dive smoothly, resurface reliably, and switch seamlessly between gasoline and electric propulsion. Armed with torpedo tubes and engineered for combat, it was no longer a theoretical experiment. It was the first truly operational submarine in a national navy. The US Navy's acquisition of the Holland in 1900 marked a global shift in how militaries viewed submarine warfare. Its successful design, with its gasoline engine for surface travel, electric motor for submerged operation, internal ballast system, and torpedo armament, offered a practical, balanced blueprint that many navies sought to emulate. Soon after, nations like Britain, Germany, Russia, and Japan accelerated their own programs. France, already ahead with a steam engine-powered Narval launched in 1899, adopted and refined similar features as steam-run submarines were fraught with issues. Yet for all their innovation, these early submarines were still fragile machines. Their diesel engines were prone to breakdown, their battery components vulnerable to flooding, and their underwater range limited by crude controls and primitive air intakes. And yet, navies pushed forward. The idea of a hidden predator beneath the sea was too powerful to ignore. In Russia, engineer Ivan Bubnov and his team developed the Deflin class in the early 1900s, followed by the more formidable Akula in 1907. Germany, meanwhile, launched the first U-boat, U-1, in 1906, a sleek, battery-powered vessel that foreshadowed the terrors to come. The Germans would refine their submarine doctrine with a cold-eyed efficiency, laying the foundation for the deadly wolfpack tactics of the coming war. In this time of transition, submarines remained both celebrated and feared by the very navies that built them. Many admirals still viewed them with suspicion, too slow, too fragile, too dishonourable. Submarines, they argued, were not fit for gentlemen's warfare, and they were largely regarded as auxiliary tools, good for coastal defence or reconnaissance, but not much else. That illusion would only survive mere weeks into World War I. If you enjoyed the video so far, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. If you want to dive deeper, check the description for some books related to everything discussed in this episode. When war erupted in Europe in the summer of 1914, naval strategists still clung to traditions that had governed the sea for centuries. Battleships and cruisers, flags flying, and guns blazing were believed to be the instruments of decisive victory. However, on September 5th, 1914, just 1 month into the conflict, the British light cruiser HMS Pathfinder was patrolling the North Sea. Unbeknownst to her crew, the German submarine U-21 lay in wait. It fired a single self-propelled torpedo, the first ever to be used successfully by a submarine in combat. It struck Pathfinder's forward magazine, igniting a massive explosion that split the vessel in two. Around 250 British sailors were killed. The sinking of Pathfinder was not only a historic milestone, the first warship ever sunk by a submarine using a self-propelled torpedo, it was also a psychological earthquake. A weapon long dismissed as a curiosity had just annihilated a modern warship from beneath the waves. The British Admiralty, shaken by the implications, moved quickly, not just to investigate, but to suppress. The full details of Pathfinder's sinking were downplayed in official reports. The press was discouraged from sensationalizing the event, because the idea that a German submarine could strike without warning from unseen depths so close to home waters threatened to erode the public's confidence in the Royal Navy, the very institution on which Britain's survival depended. The submarine was no longer a nuisance, it was a terror weapon. That terror deepened just weeks later. On September 22nd, the German U-boat U-9 encountered 3 British cruisers, HMS Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy, patrolling together in a slow-moving formation. In the space of an hour, U-9 fired torpedoes that sank all 3. Over 1,400 sailors were lost. It was a massacre, 1 submarine against 3 cruisers, and the news sent shockwaves through the British public and naval command alike. Germany recognized the potential instantly. Their U-boat fleet, though small at the start of the war, expanded quickly. Naval command shifted its focus to a new strategy: economic warfare through submarine blockade. British merchant ships became legitimate targets. The goal was clear: star Britain into submission by cutting off vital imports of food, fuel, and supplies. Allied navies scrambled to adapt. Convoy systems, depth charges, and early hydrophones were rushed into development. The British began deploying Q-ships, merchant vessels armed with hidden guns, intended to lure unsuspecting U-boats into making surface attacks and ambush them. It became a silent war of cat and mouse, fought in fog beneath the waves, and often with no survivors. And life aboard a U-boat was no less perilous. Cramped conditions, toxic air, engine fumes, and the constant fear of pressure collapse turned every patrol into psychological gauntlet. Yet the damage inflicted was staggering. By the war's end, German submarines had sunk over 5,000 Allied ships, crippling supply lines and reshaping naval strategy forever. World War I was not merely the first great submarine war. It was the moment submarines rewrote the rules of engagement. But it was still imperfect. Submarines were slow, noisy, vulnerable while surfaced, and reliant on diesel engines that demanded regular exposure to the air. The interwar years from 1919 to 1939 became a period of quiet transformation, a time when naval architects, engineers, and strategists studied past failures and quietly laid the groundwork for a deadlier generation of underwater warships. Among the key innovations of this era was the widespread adoption of the snorkel, originally developed by the Dutch. This retractable breathing mast allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged just below the surface, allowing them to stay submerged for longer and drastically reducing their vulnerability. Though the Germans dismissed the snorkel at first, they would come to rely on it heavily later in the war. Hull design also evolved. Submarines became sleeker, more hydrodynamic, and more pressure resistant. Battery capacity increased, enabling longer underwater endurance. Periscopes were refined for better optics, torpedoes became faster and more powerful, though not without teething problems. American torpedoes, for example, suffered from notorious defects early in World War II. Magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely or not at all, and depth-keeping mechanics that ran too deep. These issues crippled the US submarine campaign until finally addressed in 1943. When war returned in Europe in 1939, Germany again led with its U-boat fleet, though this time with more sophistication and a strategy honed through 2 decades of preparation. Under the leadership of Admiral Karl Donitz, the German Kriegsmarine unleashed a new phase of undersea warfare, one built on coordination and communication. Donitz perfected the Wolfpack tactic, wherein multiple U-boats, vectored by radio, would converge on Allied convoys, overwhelming their escorts with simultaneous attacks. It was efficient, terrifying, and devastating. In the early years of the Battle of Atlantic, German U-boats hunted with impunity. From 1940 to 1943, thousands of Allied merchant vessels were torpedoed and sunk. The Second Happy Time, as U-boat crews dubbed it, saw submarines lurking even off the US East Coast, where ill-defended freighters made for easy pickings. German commanders became household names. Gunther Prien, captain of U-47, infiltrated Britain's naval stronghold at Scapa Flow in 1939 and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak, killing over 800 sailors. Otto Kretschmer, known as Silent Otto, pioneered aggressive tactics and fast attacks, sinking over 40 ships and more tonnage than any other German submariner before he was captured. These men, ruthless and decorated, turned the U-boat into an icon of German military prowess. But the Allies learned, slowly, then all at once. British and American scientists refined ASDIC, an early form of sonar, and radar began to detect U-boats on the surface, even at night. High-frequency direct finding, also known as HFDUF, allowed Allied ships to triangulate U-boats' radio signals. Air patrols, especially those mounted from long-range Catalina flying boats and newly developed escort carriers, closed the mid-Atlantic air gap and devastated submarine formations. Perhaps the most decisive was the work at Bletchley Park, who cracked the German Enigma code. With decrypted messages in hand, Allied convoys could reroute, evade wolfpacks, and prepare counterattacks. The tide turned. In 1943 alone, Germany lost over 240 U-boats. The Atlantic, once a graveyard for merchant ships, became a trap for submarines. The turning point came during Black May, when U-boat losses soared to unsustainable levels, forcing a temporary withdrawal from the North Atlantic. It was a month that shattered the myth of German naval invincibility. Of the 40,000 Germans who served aboard U-boats, over 28,000 would never return. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States waged its own undersea war, one that would eventually strangle the Japanese Empire. At first, American submarines were hampered by cautious commanders and defective torpedoes, but that changed quickly. Aggressive officers like Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo and Richard O'Kane of USS Tang adopted bold attack tactics, surfacing at night to strike convoys with deadly precision. Once torpedo issues were fixed, US submarines became the scourge of Japanese logistics. By the war's end, they had sunk over 1,300 merchant ships and over half of all Japanese naval tonnage and over 30% of Japan's warships. All that with just 2% of the US Navy's personnel. The war also accelerated innovation. Late in the conflict, Germany unveiled the Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary design with a streamlined hull, large battery banks, and the ability to remain submerged for days. It was the first submarine truly designed to operate primarily underwater, not a surface ship that could dive, but a submersible predator. Though it entered service too late to affect the war's outcome, its design would influence submarine architecture for decades to come. Japan also pursued ambitious ideas. Their I-400 class submarine, the largest submarine ever built at the time, were underwater aircraft carriers, massive vessels capable of launching floatplanes from concealed hangars. They were technical marvels, but strategically irrelevant in a war already lost. By the end of the war, submarines had lost their edge and no longer inspired the fear they once did. But this loss of dominance sparked the next stage in their evolution. This came in 1954 when the United States launched the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. It was a technological revelation. Without the need for oxygen to fuel its engines, the Nautilus could remain submerged for weeks at a time, limited only by the endurance of her crew and the food on board. Her reactor core replaced the need for diesel and battery power. She sailed faster, deeper and farther than anything the world had seen. When she transmitted the now famous message, underway on nuclear power, history turned. 4 years later, Nautilus completed a secret voyage beneath the North Pole, symbolically asserting US naval reach even in the planet's most remote theater. But the full strategic significance of nuclear power propulsion emerged with the development of ballistic missile submarines. In 1960, the US Navy launched USS George Washington, the world's first submarine equipped with nuclear-tipped Polaris missiles. She could lurk in the deep for months, undetected, ready to unleash apocalypse at a moment's notice. No target was beyond her reach, and she was almost impossible to find. Not to be outdone, the Soviets developed their own nuclear-powered submarines, beginning with the November class in the 1950s and 60s, and later unveiling the massive Typhoon class in the 1970s. The Typhoons were the largest submarines ever built, with a submerged displacement nearly 7 times greater than the largest submarines of World War II. These underwater leviathans, armed with multiple independently targetable warheads, became a critical part of Cold War's balance of terror. Submarines were now pillars in the nuclear triad, alongside land-based missiles and strategic bombers, offering second strike capability that guaranteed mutual destruction. Simultaneously, the rise of stealth coatings, anechoic tiles, special hull coatings of rubber that absorb sonar pings, and pump jet propulsion made modern submarines quieter than ever. Where once the noise of a propeller could be tracked across the ocean, now a boat could glide silently for hours without a trace. Globally, the underwater race expanded. France, Britain, China, and India all developed their own nuclear submarine fleets. China's new Type 094 and 096 boats, for instance, patrol the Pacific, extending Beijing's nuclear reach. In today's world, a single submarine, silent, unseen, can carry enough firepower to destroy dozens of cities. It can collect intelligence, launch precision strikes, deploy special forces, or simply linger offshore as a geopolitical warning.